Why invading Russia is impossible. Napoleon tried in 1812. He had 600,000 men, the largest army ever assembled in Europe, the finest military mind of his generation. Veteran troops who'd conquered most of Europe. He made it to Moscow. 6 months later, he retreated with 27,000 survivors, 95% casualties, the greatest military disaster in history. Hitler tried in 1941, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft, the most powerful military force ever assembled. They were 20 miles from Moscow. 3 years later, Soviet troops were raising the hammer and sickle over the Reichstag in Berlin. Germany lost 5 million men. Sweden tried in 1708. Charles V, one of history's great military commanders, invaded with 40,000 men, defeated at Poltava. Sweden never recovered its status as a great power. Poland tried in 1605, 1610, 1618. They occupied Moscow twice. Both times, they were driven out and destroyed. The Mongols succeeded in the 13th century. That's it. That's the list. One successful invasion of Russia in 800 years. Every other attempt, no matter how powerful the invading force, ended in catastrophic failure. And here's what nobody tells you. It wasn't the Russian army that stopped them. The Russian army lost most of the major battles. Napoleon crushed them at Austerlitz, at Friedland, at Smolensk. Hitler's Wehrmacht destroyed entire Soviet armies in the opening months, captured millions of prisoners. Charles the Thinking defeated Russian forces repeatedly. The invaders won the battles. They still lost the war. Because Russia isn't defended by its army. Russia is defended by something that cannot be defeated, cannot be outmaneuvered, cannot be bribed or intimidated. Russia is defended by geography, by climate, by space itself. And those three factors create a trap that has destroyed every army that entered it for 8 centuries. This isn't about Russian military genius. This is about mathematics, about logistics, about the fundamental impossibility of sustaining a modern army across distances and conditions that exceed human capacity to manage. Let me show you exactly why invading Russia is impossible, how the trap works, why even knowing the trap exists doesn't help you escape it, and why in 2025, with all our technology, the trap is just as lethal as it was in 1812. Before we talk about why invasion fails, you need to understand what Russia actually is geographically, because most people have no concept of the scale. Russia is 6.6 million square miles. That's larger than the entire continent of North America. It's bigger than the United States and Canada combined. It spans 11 time zones. When the sun is setting in Kaliningrad on Russia's western border, it's already tomorrow morning in Kamchatka on the eastern coast. But size alone isn't the issue. Australia is huge. It's not unconquerable. The issue is that Russia's size combines with 3 other factors that create the trap. Factor 1, distance from logistics bases. Any army invading Russia from Europe has to cross Poland, Belarus, and Western Russia before reaching anything strategically important. That's 600 miles minimum just to reach Smolensk, another 250 miles to Moscow. And Moscow isn't even the strategic center anymore. The industrial heartland is beyond the Urals, another 1,000 miles east. Compare that to invading France. Paris is 200 miles from the German border. Invading Germany, Berlin is 350 miles from the French border. But Moscow is 1,000 miles from Poland. And if the Russians abandon Moscow, which they've done before, the real Russia is another 1,000 miles beyond that. Factor 2, lack of infrastructure. Western Europe is dense with roads, railroads, cities. You can move an army across France using existing infrastructure. Russia has almost none. In 1812, there were barely any roads. In 1941, there were some railroads, but the gauge was different from European railroads. German trains couldn't run on Soviet tracks. They had to rebuild every mile. Even today, Russia's infrastructure is sparse. There's the Trans-Siberian Railway and a few major highways. But most of the country is undeveloped. If you leave the main routes, you're moving through wilderness. Factor 3, climate. Russia has the most extreme continental climate on Earth. Winters reach 40 degrees strict across most of the country. Summers hit 100 degrees. Spring and fall bring mud. Rasputitsa, they call it. The season of mud. When the snow melts or the rain falls, the roads become impassable. Vehicles sink, infantry bogs down, nothing moves. These 3 factors create the mathematical trap. To invade Russia, you need to move a massive army across 1,000 plus miles of undeveloped territory through extreme weather while maintaining supply lines that stretch back to your home country. And the deeper you go, the longer the supply lines, the harder everything gets, and the more vulnerable you become. Here's the mechanism. Let's use Napoleon as the case study because his invasion is the clearest example of how the trap works. June 1812. Napoleon crosses the Niemen River into Russia with 600,000 men. This is the largest army ever assembled in Europe. French, Polish, German, Italian troops, veterans of a dozen campaigns, the finest cavalry in the world, artillery that had smashed every opponent. Napoleon's plan was simple: force the Russian army into a decisive battle near the border, destroy them, dictate peace terms, march home victorious. The whole campaign should take 3 months maximum. The Russians didn't cooperate. Instead of fighting, they retreated, burned their supply depots as they went, destroyed crops, drove livestock east. They implemented a scorched earth strategy. If Napoleon wanted to feed his army, he'd have to do it from supply lines stretching back to Poland. Here's where the math becomes brutal. An army of 600,000 men requires 600,000 pounds of food per day. Minimum. That's assuming 1 pound of bread or grain per soldier, which is barely enough. Add in horses, which the army relied on for cavalry and transport. Napoleon had 200,000 horses. Each horse needs 20 pounds of fodder per day. That's 4 million pounds of horse feed daily. Total, 4.6 million pounds of supplies per day, every single day. And it all has to be transported from Poland across roads that barely existed. Through territory the Russians had stripped of food. Napoleon's supply wagons were pulled by horses. Each wagon carried about 200 pounds and required 4 horses. To move 4.6 million pounds per day, you'd need 3,033 wagons. But those wagons need to travel from Poland to wherever the army is, then return empty. If the army is 400 miles into Russia, that's an 800-mile round trip. At 20 miles per day, that's 40 days per trip. This means you don't need 3,833 wagons. You need 40 times that. 153,320 wagons just to feed the army. And those wagons require horses. 613,280 horses. But those horses also need food, which requires more wagons, which require more horses. Do you see the trap? The deeper into Russia you go, the more supply wagons you need. The more wagons you need, the more horses you need. The more horses you need, the more food you need to feed the horses. It's an exponential curve. At some point, the entire logistics system collapses because you're using more resources to move supplies than the supplies themselves provide. Napoleon tried to solve this by living off the land, forage from the countryside, seize food from Russian farms. But the Russians burned everything. There was nothing to seize, so the army started starving, not in battle, just from marching. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, 2 months into the campaign, he'd lost 150,000 men, not from combat, from starvation, disease, desertion. 1/4 of his army gone before the major battle even happened. He pressed on. Reached Moscow in September. The city was empty. The Russians had evacuated it and burned it. Napoleon occupied a burned-out shell. No food, no supplies, winter approaching. His supply lines stretched 1,000 miles back to Poland through hostile territory. He had no choice. He had to retreat. The retreat was annihilation. Winter hit in October. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees. The army had no winter clothing because Napoleon thought the campaign would be over by then. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Horses died. Wagons were abandoned. Discipline collapsed. The Russians didn't have to fight. They just followed and picked off stragglers. Cossack cavalry harassed the flanks. Partisans attacked supply convoys. The cold did the rest. Napoleon started with 600,000 men. He left Russia with 27,000 effectives, 573,000 casualties, the greatest military disaster in history. And it wasn't the Russian army that destroyed him. It was logistics, distance, cold, the trap. Let's jump forward 129 years. Hitler invades the Soviet Union. June 22nd, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 2,500 aircraft. The most powerful military force ever assembled. Hitler knew about Napoleon. He studied the campaign. He thought he could avoid the mistakes. He planned to finish the invasion before winter. Blitzkrieg. Lightning war. Move fast. Encircle and destroy Soviet armies. Capture Moscow before the snow falls. The opening was spectacular. German forces advanced 300 miles in 3 weeks. They surrounded entire Soviet armies, captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners. By September, Army Group Center was 200 miles from Moscow. Victory seemed certain, but the trap was already closing. The same trap that caught Napoleon. First, distance. The Germans were 800 miles from their supply bases in Poland. Every shell, every bullet, every drop of fuel had to be trucked or railed across that distance. The railroads were different gauge. The Germans had to either rebuild the tracks or transfer cargo between trains at the border. Massive bottleneck. Second, Soviet resistance. Unlike Napoleon's campaign, where the Russians avoided major battles early, the Soviets fought constantly. They lost most battles, but fighting slowed the German advance. Every day of delay pushed the campaign closer to winter. Third, the mud. In October, the Rasputitsa hit. The fall rains turned unpaved Russian roads into swamps. German vehicles sank to their axles. Tanks bogged down. The advance stopped. not because of Soviet resistance, because of mud. By the time the ground froze and movement became possible again, it was November. Winter arrived. The same winter that killed Napoleon's army. German troops were in summer uniforms. Hitler was so confident of quick victory he hadn't ordered winter gear. Temperatures dropped to 40 degree hours. Soldiers froze. Vehicle engines wouldn't start. Oil froze in gun mechanisms. The offensive reached the outskirts of Moscow in December. German forward units could see the Kremlin through binoculars, but they couldn't advance. The cold was killing them. Supply lines were collapsing. Fuel wasn't arriving. Ammunition wasn't arriving. Winter clothing wasn't arriving. December 5th, 1941, the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped for winter, hit the frozen Germans. The Wehrmacht, which hadn't retreated in any campaign since 1939, fell back. Moscow was saved. The Germans fought for 3 more years. They never got close to Moscow again. By 1944, Soviet forces were in Eastern Europe. By 1945, they were in Berlin. Germany lost 5 million men on the Eastern Front, the largest military defeat in German history. And again, it wasn't the Soviet army that beat them. The Soviet army lost most of the battles in 1941. They lost millions of prisoners. But the trap, the same trap that caught Napoleon, caught Hitler. Distance, logistics, winter, the mathematics of invading Russia. Here's what makes the trap inescapable. You might think modern technology solves the problem. Aircraft can deliver supplies. Trucks are better than wagons. Modern armies can operate in cold weather. Wrong. The trap scales with technology. Let me show you why. Modern armies consume more supplies than Napoleonic armies. A single M1 Abrams tank uses 3 gallons of fuel per mile. If it travels 100 miles, that's 300 gallons, 2,400 pounds of fuel for one tank. A mechanized division has 300 tanks. That's 700 to 20,000 pounds of fuel per day just for tanks. Plus fuel for trucks, armored vehicles, generators. Add ammunition. A modern artillery barrage fires thousands of shells per hour. Each shell weighs 100 pounds. One battle can consume millions of pounds of ammunition. Add food. Modern soldiers eat more than Napoleon's troops. MREs, bottled water, medical supplies. A modern army of 100,000 men requires 10 million pounds of supplies per day. 10 times what Napoleon needed per soldier. So, yes, we have trucks and aircraft, but we need to move 10 times more supplies across the same impossible distances through the same brutal climate. Aircraft help, but they have limits. A C-17 cargo plane carries 170,000 pounds. To supply 100,000 troops for one day requires 59 C-17 flights. Every single day. That's one flight landing every 24 minutes, 24 hours a day. And that's assuming you have airfields, fuel for the planes, and air superiority. In a real invasion of Russia, you wouldn't have air superiority. Russian air defenses are the most sophisticated on Earth. S-400, S-500 systems can hit aircraft 250 miles away. You'd lose planes, the supply flights would stop. Trucks are better than wagons, but Russian roads are still terrible, and trucks break down. In desert warfare during Gulf War, the US military had a 30% breakdown rate for trucks. In Russian winter, it would be higher. Batteries die in extreme cold, fluids freeze, mechanical parts crack. Modern militaries are more dependent on logistics than Napoleon ever was. Napoleon's soldiers carried muskets that needed gunpowder and balls. Simple. A modern soldier carries weapons that need specific caliber ammunition, batteries for optics, radios that need encryption keys and charging. Everything is more complex, more fragile, more dependent on supply chains. The trap doesn't get easier with technology, it gets harder, because modern armies are more complex, more fuel dependent, and more vulnerable to supply disruption. And the Russian geography hasn't changed. Still 1,000 miles of undeveloped territory. Still 40-degree winters. Still mud season. Let me give you the current scenario. It's 2025. NATO hypothetically decides to invade Russia. Assume they assemble 500,000 troops in Poland, modern equipment, air support, logistics planned perfectly. What happens? Day 1 to 30. The invasion advances quickly. NATO forces have air superiority initially. They push 300 miles into Russia. Belarus falls. Russian forces retreat, trading space for time. Just like 1812, just like 1941. Day 31 to 60. Supply lines start stretching. Every mile forward requires more trucks, more fuel, more logistics. NATO establishes supply bases every 100 miles, but each base needs troops to defend it. Troops that aren't advancing. The combat to logistics ratio starts shifting. For every combat soldier at the front, you need 5 in the rear moving supplies. Day 61 to 90. Russian resistance stiffens. They're fighting closer to their supply bases now. NATO forces are 600 miles from Poland. Russian artillery, operating from shorter supply lines, increases fire. NATO ammunition consumption spikes. Supply convoys get hit by Russian missiles. Losses mount. Day 91, Rasputitsa, fall rains hit. Roads turn to mud. Off-road movement stops. NATO offensive bogs down. Russians don't have to attack. They just wait. Day 120. Ground freezes. NATO resumes advance, but it's November. Winter is coming. Do they have winter gear? Do the vehicles work in 40-degree tires? Can they maintain momentum? Day 150. Winter. Full force. NATO troops, even with modern cold weather gear, suffer. Vehicles fail. Aircraft have reduced sortie rates because of weather. Supply flights get grounded. Russian forces, equipped for their own winter, counterattack. Day 180 to 365. Retreat or annihilation. NATO has the same choice Napoleon had. Retreat while you still can, or stay and die. The casualties would be catastrophic, not from Russian military superiority, from logistics collapse in extreme conditions. This isn't speculation. This is what the mathematics of logistics says will happen. Every war game, every military analysis reaches the same conclusion. You cannot sustain a large mechanized army 1,000 miles into Russia through winter. The supply requirements exceed physical capacity to deliver them. Now, you might ask, what about nuclear weapons? If NATO invaded with conventional forces and started losing, wouldn't they use nukes? That's not invasion. That's annihilation. Nuclear weapons end the war, but they don't conquer territory. You can't invade a nuclear power because if you push them to collapse, they launch mutually assured destruction. So nuclear weapons make conventional invasion even more impossible. Not just logistically impossible, but strategically suicidal. What about China? Could China invade Russia from the east? Same problem, different direction. Siberia is even less developed than European Russia. The Trans-Siberian Railway is the only major supply line. One railroad. It's 5,000 miles from Beijing to Moscow. The distances are even more impossible than invading from the west. Plus, most of Russia's population and industry are in the west. Conquering Siberia gives you frozen wasteland, not strategic victory. The only historical successful invasion was the Mongols in the 13th century. How did they do it? They were nomadic cavalry. They didn't need supply lines. Their horses ate grass. They drank from rivers. They lived off the land. They moved in small, independent groups that could scatter and reconcentrate. And most importantly, they invaded during the medieval warm period when the climate was milder. Modern armies can't operate like Mongols. We need fuel, ammunition, food, delivered by complex logistics. We fight with massed forces that need coordination. We're bound to roads and supply lines. The Mongol method is impossible with modern militaries. So here's the final truth. Russia is unconquerable. Not because of its army, though the Russian military is formidable. Not because of its nuclear weapons, though those make invasion suicidal. Russia is unconquerable because of geography, distance, and climate. These three factors create a trap that has destroyed every invading army for 800 years. Napoleon had 600,000 men and genius strategy. Destroyed. Hitler had 3 million men and blitzkrieg. Destroyed. Charles X had veteran Swedish troops. Destroyed. Every single one of them learned the same lesson. You can win battles in Russia. You can advance hundreds of miles. You can even reach Moscow. But you cannot sustain an army across those distances through those conditions. The logistics become impossible. The winter kills you. The space swallows you. And the Russians understand this. Their entire defensive strategy for centuries has been based on it. Trade space for time. Retreat. Burn what you can't take. Let the invader extend. Let the supply lines stretch. Let winter come. Then counterattack when the invader is frozen, starving, and 1,000 miles from home. It worked against Napoleon. It worked against Hitler. It would work again today because the trap is mathematical. It's not about tactics or technology. It's about the physical impossibility of moving enough supplies across enough distance through enough hostile conditions. In 2025, with all our satellites, our precision weapons, our advanced logistics, we still cannot solve the fundamental equation. An army needs supplies. Supplies have weight. Weight must be moved across distance. Distance in Russia is vast. Climate is extreme. Infrastructure is minimal. The math doesn't work. It never has. It never will. Russia has been invaded repeatedly because it looks vulnerable. Huge, but spread thin. Large army, but not the most advanced. Weak economy compared to the West. Invaders always think the same thing. We're stronger, better equipped, better led. We'll be different. They're not different. The trap doesn't care about confidence. It doesn't care about technology. It doesn't care about military genius. The trap is geography, mathematics, and winter. And those three factors have destroyed every army that entered Russia for 8 centuries. So when you hear analysts talk about NATO versus Russia or China versus Russia, or any scenario where a foreign power invades Russian territory, understand this. It's not happening. Not because Russia is too strong militarily, but because Russia is too big, too cold, and too empty. The country itself is the defense. The weather is the weapon. The distance is the trap. Napoleon learned it. Hitler learned it. Charles XV learned it. Anyone who tries next will learn it again, because the trap is permanent. It existed before modern nations. It will exist after them. As long as Russia is 6.6 million square miles of continental extreme climate with minimal infrastructure, it cannot be conquered by conventional invasion. That's not Russian propaganda. That's not military mystique. That's mathematics, logistics, and history. 3 empires tried. 3 empires failed. The pattern is clear. The lesson is written in frozen corpses from Moscow to Poland, and anyone who ignores it will add their own casualties to the list. If this changed how you see military power, if you understand now that geography can be more powerful than any army, subscribe. Because the real power in geopolitics isn't just weapons or soldiers. It's understanding the terrain, the climate, the math. And in Russia's case, the math says invasion is impossible. The trap is set. It's been waiting for 800 years, and it's never failed yet.